It is 1956, a photo studio in the small town of Älmhult in southern Sweden. A young designer named Gillis Lundgren is trying to fit a wooden side table into the back of his car for a catalog shoot. It will not go in. The legs stick out, the trunk will not close. So Lundgren does something simple. He takes a screwdriver, he removes the legs, he lays them flat next to the tabletop. Everything slides in, the boot closes. He drives away. He has just stumbled into the most defensible retail strategy of the 20th century. Within 40 years, the company he works for will sell furniture to 1 in 10 Europeans, run more than 500 stores in over 60 countries, and become the largest furniture seller on earth. Its founder will die a billionaire who drove a 15-year-old Volvo and flew economy class. None of that is written yet. Right now, in 56, there is just a designer, a station wagon, and a table with the legs taken off. Rewind 13 years. The province of Småland in the deep south of Sweden. It is poor country. Thin soil, long winters. Pine forest broken by stone walls farmers spent generations clearing by hand. The people here are famous in Sweden for one trait above all others. They do not waste anything. A nail bent in the morning is straightened in the afternoon and used in the evening. A wool sweater outlives the child who wore it first. On a small farm called Älmhult, near the village of Agunnaryd, a quiet boy with a stutter is growing up watching his father struggle to make the land pay. The boy's name is Ingvar Kamprad. He is 6 years old when he starts his first business, buying matches in bulk from Stockholm in 100 packs and reselling them to his neighbors by the box. He learns two things almost immediately. People will pay for convenience. And the bigger the order he places, the lower the price he gets. By the time Ingvar Kamprad is 11, the matches have grown into a small operation. He bicycles around the parish selling Christmas tree decorations, fish, garden seeds, ballpoint pens, and pencils. He keeps the money in a tin box under his bed. On the 28th of July 1943, 4 months before his 18th birthday, his father gives him a gift, a small sum of money for doing well at school, despite the stutter and despite the dyslexia. The boy uses the money to register a trading company at the kitchen table of his uncle Ernst. He names it from his own initials, the family farm Älmhult and the village Agunnaryd, IKEA. He runs it out of a converted dairy shed on the farm. The company sells anything he can buy cheap and post in an envelope. If you are watching this and enjoying the story, hit subscribe. There are a lot more builds like this one to come. For 5 years, IKEA has nothing to do with furniture at all. 1948, Kamprad is 22. Sweden has been spared the war that destroyed most of Europe, and the country is in the middle of a quiet domestic revolution. Working families are moving out of cramped pre-war tenements into new apartments. They need tables, chairs, shelves, beds. But Swedish furniture, in the late 40s, is expensive. It is sold through small specialist shops that take large margins. The factories are run as a cartel, the prices are fixed, the showrooms are coordinated, and a poor family in Småland buying a kitchen table can expect to spend a serious fraction of a month's wages on it. Kamprad notices this. He starts adding furniture to his mail-order catalog. Locally made, locally photographed, shipped by post. The prices undercut the high street shops by a wide margin. The orders pour in. By 1951, furniture is the only thing he sells. He stops everything else. The cartel notices. The cartel is not pleased. The Swedish furniture cartel, in the early 50s, is one of the most tightly organized trade groups in the country. The big manufacturers fix wholesale prices. The retail chains agree not to undercut each other. Trade fairs are policed by industry committees that decide who is allowed in and who is shown the door. The whole system depends on one thing: keeping consumer prices high and the supply chain quiet. Then a 25-year-old from a dairy shed in Småland shows up selling the same kind of furniture, by post, for half the money. At first the cartel tries to ignore him. Then they try to talk to him. Then they try threats. None of it works. So in 1953, they go to the trade fair organizers in Stockholm and demand action. Kamprad is barred. He cannot exhibit. He cannot meet wholesale buyers. He cannot photograph his catalog at the fair. The cartel believes this will be the end of IKEA. They are about to be very, very wrong. The cartel does not stop at the trade fair ban. They move to the supply chain. One by one, Swedish furniture factories receive quiet calls from the bigger players in the industry. The message is the same. Stop supplying that mail-order man in Älmhult, or stop supplying us. Within a year, almost every domestic factory IKEA depends on has cut him off. Orders are cancelled. Half-finished shipments are held back. Designs are pulled. Kamprad is 27 years old. His company has finally found something it is good at. The customers love it. The orders are coming in. And his suppliers have just been turned against him by men in suits in Stockholm. For most small entrepreneurs, this is the end. You cannot sell furniture you cannot manufacture. The smart move is to give up, take a job, save your reputation. Kamprad does not give up. He gets out a map, and he starts looking east. 1961. The Iron Curtain has been across Europe for 15 years. The Soviet bloc is officially closed to Western business. But Poland is hungry for hard currency, and the People's Republic has factories sitting idle with skilled woodworkers and cheap timber. Kamprad drives across the border with a translator and a satchel of design drawings. He visits a state-run furniture combine outside the city of Lodz. The deal he proposes is simple. IKEA will send the designs and pay in advance in West German marks. Poland will manufacture the chairs and tables to specification. Both sides win. IKEA gets supply the Swedish cartel cannot touch, and the communist factory gets hard currency it desperately needs. The bureaucracy is brutal. The shipments are slow. The quality varies. But within a few years, Poland is producing tens of thousands of IKEA items every month, at prices the Swedish cartel cannot come close to matching. The cartel's boycott has not just failed, it has made IKEA cheaper than ever. Now we are back where the story began. 1956, Älmhult. The young designer Gillis Lundgren, IKEA's fourth full-time employee, takes the legs off a leaf-shaped side table to fit it into the back of his car. The table is called Levet. Lundgren delivers it to the studio, reassembles it for the photograph, and on the drive home he cannot stop thinking about what just happened. The customer who buys this table is going to have the same problem he just had. The retailer who ships it is going to have the same problem. The warehouse storing it is going to have the same problem. So why not ship the table flat, legs in a box, instructions in the box, customer assembles it at home, Lundgren pitches it to Kamprad, Kamprad listens. The economics are obvious. Flat boxes stack, stacks of boxes fit on pallets, pallets fit in shipping containers. One truck can suddenly carry the furniture of 10 trucks. Labor is pushed onto the buyer, costs collapse. In 1953, Kamprad had already done something unusual. He bought an old joiner's workshop in Älmhult and turned it into a showroom. Not a shop, a showroom. Customers could walk in, sit on the chairs, lie on the beds, see the quality with their own hands, and then place a mail order at the counter. It was meant to prove the furniture was real. The cartel had been telling people that cheap mail-order furniture must be junk. The showroom answered that with wood and fabric. It worked so well that in 1958, Kamprad opened the world's first proper IKEA store on the same site. 6,500 square meters. The biggest furniture display in Scandinavia. A restaurant in the corner so families could spend the whole day there. A children's play area so parents would not rush. Almost every feature of every IKEA store still operating in the world today was invented inside that one building. In that small Småland town. By the mid-60s, Kamprad has assembled what is, by any honest measure, a new way of selling physical objects to human beings. Look at the pieces. The Polish factories make the components for almost nothing. The flat packs collapse shipping and warehousing costs. The customer drives to a large warehouse on the outskirts of town, walks through a one-way maze that exposes them to every product the company sells, eats a cheap meal, picks the box off a shelf themselves, drives the box home in their own car, and assembles the furniture at their own kitchen table, using their own time and their own labor. Every cost the traditional furniture trade carried, IKEA had pushed somewhere else. Onto suppliers. Onto cardboard. Onto the customer. The price of a kitchen table dropped by half, then half again. Furniture stopped being a once-in-a-decade purchase for a working family and became something young couples could afford in their first apartment, then replace when they moved out. There was one more piece. The Catalogue. Every year IKEA printed a thick free magazine and dropped it into the mailbox of every household in every region where it operated. By the 1980s, the IKEA Catalogue was the second most printed publication on Earth, behind only the Bible. Hundreds of millions of copies a year, in dozens of languages photographed in painstaking detail at the company's own in-house studio back in Älmhult. The catalog was not advertising, it was a quiet annual reminder that this company existed, that the prices had not gone up, that the new sofa you have been thinking about is on page 84 for $299 of your local currency. Kamprad had stumbled into the kind of distribution most companies would kill for. Free, repeated household-level brand contact, year after year. A free magazine paid for by his own factories, sitting on the coffee table of every European family for a generation. 1963, the first store outside Sweden opens in Oslo, Norway. 1969, Denmark. 1973, the first store outside Scandinavia opens in Spreitenbach, Switzerland. Then comes the move that changes everything. 1974, the first IKEA store in West Germany opens on the outskirts of Munich. Germany is the largest furniture market in Europe and one of the most conservative. The local industry is skeptical. They expect the Swedish upstart to fail. Instead, the Munich store is mobbed on opening day. Within a decade, Germany becomes IKEA's single biggest market in the world, a title it still holds today. From there, the expansion is relentless. France in '78, Britain in '87, Italy, then Spain, then Czechoslovakia, then a tentative entry into the United States. By the early 90s, IKEA is opening a new full-size store almost every month, somewhere on the planet. The dairy shed in Småland is now headquarters to a multinational that employs more people than most armies. Today, the numbers are difficult to comprehend. IKEA operates more than 500 stores across 63 countries. Sales in the last financial year, 45.1 billion euros, 222,000 employees, 915 million in-store visits in a single year. More than 1 in every 10 people on Earth walked into an IKEA last year. The company sells 1 of every 10 pieces of furniture purchased anywhere in the world. Germany alone accounts for over 15% of total sales. The Catalogue, after 70 years of publication, was finally discontinued in 2021, replaced by an app, but the brand it built still drives traffic to those 500 warehouses on the outskirts of cities from Tokyo to Lisbon to Dubai. And all of it traces back to one place, a dairy shed on a small farm called Älmhult near a village called Agunnaryd in the poorest province of southern Sweden, started by a 17-year-old who could barely read his own handwriting. Ingvar Kamprad himself was always a complicated figure. The world's wealthiest furniture seller drove the same 15-year-old Volvo for decades, ate lunch at the staff canteen, flew economy class, and lived in the same modest house in the small Swiss village he had moved to for tax reasons. He told employees that wasted money was a sin. He believed genuinely that the IKEA mission was to bring beautiful furniture to people who could not otherwise afford it. He also, in the 1940s and 50s, was deeply involved with a Swedish fascist organization, a fact he publicly acknowledged in 1994 and called the greatest mistake of his life. He never fully escaped that history. He worked into his late 80s, then retired to the same village in Sweden where he had started. He died at home in Småland on the 27th of January, 2018, aged 91. He had outlived almost every member of the cartel that had tried to crush him 65 years earlier. What he left behind is a paradox, a company that takes one of the most expensive purchases of a working family's life, furniture, and makes it cheap enough that a young couple can fill an apartment for a week's wages. A company that does it by demanding the buyer drive further, walk further, lift more, and assemble the thing themselves with a small metal key, while a soft Scandinavian voice plays over the speakers and the smell of meatballs drift from the canteen. None of it would exist without a teenager who turned a registration form at his uncle's kitchen table into a 45 billion euro empire. None of it would exist without a designer who could not fit a leaf-shaped side table into the back of his station wagon. Built from a shed, a teenager from Småland, and a problem with a station wagon. If you want to know how more impossible things actually got built, subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this one waiting.